CNFers, if you want signed, personalized copies of The Frontrunner, you might have heard of it, for the holiday season, email me, creativenonfictionpodcast@gmail.com, and I'll email you a PayPal invoice and ask you how you want your book signed. It'll be $30 total, and that covers media rate shipping. I know how to splurge. While supplies last, okay? Also, Thursday, December 4th, 7 p.m., I'll be at Hodgepodge Books in Eugene delivering my now world-famous biography lecture. Come, grab a drink or a mocktail at the best book bar in town and listen to me yuck it up.
This is the other fun thing about making art is you discover things about your art as you're going through it and as you're making it.
CNFers, it's the Creative Nonfiction Podcast, a show where I speak to primarily writers about the art and craft of telling true stories, and, if we're lucky, how crappy we feel. I'm Brendan O'Mara. You damn right. Got some really nice notes and emails and DMs and IG comments, some men's underwear in the mail, JK, about reaching episode number 500 of the show. A great chat with the one and only John McPhee. How awesome was that? Thank you very much for all those messages. It means a lot after all these years that the show still remains in tune. It's got great tone, great tonality. Anyway, point being, thank you. Point also being, we celebrate it, but we move on. It's episode 501 with Julian Brave NoiseCat, author of the memoir We Survived the Night. It's published by Knopf. It's a pretty spectacular debut, and we have a lively chat about it, and the writing and the structuring of it. Julian is a writer, a filmmaker, a powwow dancer, and a student of Salish art and history. That's a primer. I'll offer more in a second. Show notes of this episode and more at brendano'mara.com. Hey, bookmark it so you can browse for hot blogs and sign up for my two very important newsletters, the flagship Rage Against the Algorithm, which will include my 2025 holiday gift guide for the new issue, and Pitch Club. Welcome to pitchclub.substack.com. If you ever wanted to know the ins and outs of crafting winning pitches to land your work and make millions. Also, if you care to support the podcast with a few dollar bills, visit patreon.com/CNFpod. We had a great Procrasti-Zoom happy be half hour with a few people, including me. And it was an international affair. We just hung out and talked about writing and went on our way. It's been a few weeks since I did it, but I'll do it again. Become a paid member to get access to these or more structured Zooms. Let me be the flax egg that binds together your bakes. Patreon also rolled out its own kind of maybe not evil social media thing called Quips. And I've been shooting small little videos with these quips, and they're getting a lot of impressions because I'm something of an early adopter here. I think Jack Conte, who's the CEO and founder of Patreon, is more of a force for good than all the other tech overlords. So we'll see if he can avoid the slouching towards shitification. I want to devote more time and attention to people, not algorithms. And with Patreon, it appears to be more people-focused. So says every social media platform ever. So Julian, man, what a cool dude. Yeah, he really came to play ball, which is fun for me. His memoir blends personal history, family history, cultural history, coyote lore, and even some journalistic spurs in the storytelling, which makes it a very shape-shifting kind of text, much like his coyote ancestors. So it's kind of a meta kind of thing, I think I'm using the term right. The book has been getting a lot of attention, and deservedly so. His work has appeared in the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Washington Post. He has won many awards for his journalism, and his debut documentary, Sugarcane, premiered at the 2024 Sundance Film Festival. He is a proud member of the Canim Lake Band. He is at @NoiseCat on Instagram. And in this conversation, we talk about his early vision for the book, hidden histories, how he aimed for a woven text, how the book was a study in transformation, non-unidirectional assimilation, writing what you don't know, and his Bob Caro story, which is pretty hilarious. I believe we're ready to rock and or roll. Parting shot on being methodical, regimented, and not cramming. But for now, it's high time we cue up the montage riff.
This is the question of my life.
What are you doing? Look at yourself. Look at what you're doing.
Definitely louder than whatever dumb fuck question is that you want to ask them.
This is going to have to interest somebody somewhere other than me.
Making a living and having a holistic career as an artist, how do you navigate that?
Well, I come at it from a distinct perspective culturally. I feel that in America, especially because I work in both Canada and the United States, those are my two primary countries. I'm both Canadian and American. My nation is from Canada. I'm First Nations, as we say in Canada, but I grew up in Oakland, California. And so I work across two slightly different markets, so to speak, for storytelling about Indigenous peoples. And there is a difference. In Canada, I was in a green room for a cable TV show with an Indigenous showrunner from Manitoba who was on the 4th season of his show. And I was thinking to myself, when on earth in the United States would I be next to an Indigenous artist in the green room to a cable TV show? That would never happen in America. I'm sorry. It just would not. Native people do not have that visibility in this country. This country, I'm going to say it this way. This country really hates Indians, man. Like, it's hard to overstate the extent to which there was a true effort to kill off Native people in this country. There were genocidal wars in multiple parts of the continent. It's not like it was all concentrated in one part of these 50 states. It happened in lots of different locations, very significantly in the one I grew up in too, by the way, California, which is interesting because California is it's considered like, the most progressive state in a lot of ways. It's very diverse. Well, it also had the most bloody history in its relationship to Native people. The gold rush was crazy. And by the way, there's a football team called the 49ers out there. This is like still part of the state's history. Anyways, so I'm really aware of that cultural and antagonism. It's like some forms of latent subconscious hate towards Native people that exists in our culture, and is reflected in the cultural institutions insofar as they are still barely willing to tell our stories and to highlight them and to see them as fundamental to the American story. In America, you can be talking about race and you're talking about anybody other than Native Americans. And in Canada, it's actually kind of the opposite. If you're talking about race, like you're talking about Indigenous peoples maybe first. I mean, not that there aren't other racial conversations happening in Canada, but the conversation about truth and reconciliation, the history of Indigenous peoples and our cultural genocide in Canada is just ahead of where it is in the United States. And that's just the truth. So I feel like I have to make a living, this is where the rubber meets the road for me. I feel like I'm paddling my little canoe up the torrent of American culture, which is, we can say all the things that are impacting all of us, is not interested as much anymore with long form storytelling in any medium. Like Hollywood just had its worst month on record since the 90s, I believe, with a number of box office hits. I mean, like Sydney Sweeney was out there with but let's be real, like she's probably like one of the it hot girls of Hollywood right now. Like that's just the honest way to put that. And they couldn't get people to go watch Sydney Sweeney at the movie theater this month. Like that is where the art is at, people. I listened to a podcast about a guy with an Academy Award. He's got one of the damn Oscars on his shelf, who has a $650,000 mortgage that just went into forbearance. And he was being responsible. He didn't buy the $1 million house. He was paying ahead on his mortgage. And he has worked so little because so few films are being made right now in the last 2 years that is his culture's in a recession. And, the same is happening. We're still seeing similar things with print culture because attention spans are getting screwed. And literacy itself is on the decline. So, those things are all for all of us. And then I feel, this is just how I feel, that I on top of all that have to convince people to spend a long time with a people and a story that is not one that this country has usually spent a long time on, because one of the logical conclusions of that is the mass culture of the country, the stories that this country wanted to hear about itself and its history and its land, were not often actually ones with natives in them, or at least not ones with natives in them that weren't like dying at the end of a gun in a cowboy western, which is, by the way, one of the genres of storytelling, the Hollywood Western, that literally built the cultural factory of the free world, Hollywood.
Yeah, and you bring up the 49ers too, and I was reading last year the illustrated graphic novelization of Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's Indigenous Peoples History of the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And speaking of sports teams, I didn't realize that the Texas Rangers were named after these Rangers who went out and committed these genocidal acts against the indigenous and native people. And I was just like, holy shit. It's a name on its surface that doesn't elicit a degree of racial hackles the way the Washington football team did. But like, oh my God, you're celebrating murderers in that regard. It's like, that's a name that truly needs its own reckoning, but it kind of hides in plain sight.
It literally just happened that they decided to restore the medals of honor to the Army veterans who committed the genocide against the massacre at Wounded Knee in 1890. This literally just happened in our culture. Like, I don't know how to interpret that in any other way than this culture is happy to celebrate with the highest distinction for a veteran in the land, the massacre of its indigenous peoples. That is the logical conclusion of that having just happened.
Yeah, and you write about in the book too about I believe Dakota 38 of the great emancipator, like in the week of, say, freeing the slaves.
Within 6 days.
Yeah.
Crazy. I think America has never grappled with this truth. And I'm not saying that one is more important than the other. I'm just saying that they need to be both contended with at the same time, which I swear is possible. We can walk and chew gum at the same time, but for some reason, we just seem not to be able to do it on this one. I mean, listen, we're all paying attention to like multiple screens at once now. Can't we just both acknowledge the genocide of indigenous peoples and the enslavement of African Americans as the two original sins of this country? And here is my proof. The great emancipator, Abraham Lincoln, freed the slaves, or began to, with the Emancipation Proclamation 6 days after the largest mass execution in United States history of 38 Dakota combatants in a war against the United States and militia in Minnesota. That happened within the same week. And Lincoln, the great emancipator, he signed the death the sentence. He reviewed the sentence and he said, yes, you can kill these 38 ones. His office did, at least.
It's stories like sobering and tragic stories like that are so integral to the book you wrote, and these hidden histories that so many in this country don't want to look at. But I'm so grateful that a writer of your skill and taste and vision like brings that to the fore so we can learn from these things. But it's just like, I always wonder, like, wow, what else are we missing? And I'm thankful that you're bringing this to the light, but what else are we missing, right?
I completely agree with you. And I think that is one of the fundamental questions that I'm actually asking, I guess, in my work, because, in both We Survived the Night, the book, and my first documentary, Sugarcane, I talk about a pattern of infanticide at the Indian residential school. That's the segregated indigenous segregated educational institution for indigenous people that my family was sent to. This one was near Williams Lake, British Columbia, Canada. And in the documentary, I co-directed about that with my friend and colleague, Emily Cassie. We found, for the first time in any major work, in any media as well, a pattern of infanticide at that institution, wherein babies, there were multiple parts of it, but the core part of it were babies born to students and sometimes nuns at this institution were being put in the trash incinerator. We know this happened because that is where my father was found when he, like, minutes after his birth. And so if that was true at one of the 139 schools in Canada, where, by the way, there has been a 15-year commitment to what they call truth and reconciliation. So they've actually been devoting resources to looking into and investigating and talking about this history. And in the United States, there was a federal inquiry under Deb Haaland for like 3-ish years of the Biden administration that is now over. And during that federal inquiry, the United States was still learning basic facts about its Native American boarding schools, like how many institutions were there that were federally funded by the federal government. Think about that for like 1 second. Until like 2 years ago, less than 2 years ago, we did not even know how many of these schools existed in America. They didn't have a census. They didn't know how many of them there were. Like, they didn't know if there were 300 or 500 or whether there were 10 or 50. Like, they did not know, which is wild, which I think begs the question, like, what else don't we know, man? And I think for indigenous peoples in our history, that question actually resounds in many directions, and not all of them are tragic. This is another important point. I think that actually when you are enlivened to the presence and history and persistent reality of indigenous people, I think you are also enlivened to lots of other facts and realities about North American culture and history more broadly. And that, I guess, that is sort of the vantage point from which I try to tell my stories.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, it's great, deeply and greatly illuminating stuff. And just when you were looking to tackle this book as a project, which took you the better part of 4 years to do, just what were you thinking as you were approaching it? What did it look like at its conception, and how did that evolve over the course of your writing and your research?
I was so lost at the beginning, man. I mean, I didn't know what I was doing. My initial idea, I'll say it because, this is a podcast about nonfiction and craft. My initial sort of book model, because, we all come into our project with like some version of like, I saw this person do this and this person do that, and I'm like going to try to put them together in my own kind of a way.
Yeah.
My version of that was, I thought I was going to be writing a foreign correspondent book about Indian country. So like a domestic foreign correspondent, in a sense, about a people who are seen as foreign in their own homelands, in the vein of Age of Ambition by Evan Osnos. So firstly, I thought of it more as a reported book when I first got started, which I think is interesting. And he organizes that book into 3 thematic sections. And so when I started writing We Survived the Night, it began with 3 thematic sections, each that were going to give an argument about contemporary indigenous life on this continent. The first one was called Apocalypse, and it was going to be about indigenous peoples as post-apocalyptic peoples who had already lived through the apocalypse of colonization, which eliminated our world. I still think that's a good take, and I'm still trying to figure out a way to bring that out more in my work. Second was Odyssey, which was about indigenous peoples returning to and reclaiming home and homelands. And the third was going to be about Trickster, which is kind of the one that the whole book is now about, which is about, indigenous peoples as echoes of our trickster forefathers who, were making the world through means that were both altruistic and no good. And as the trickster tends to, the trickster is a transformer, a shapeshifter. They take primacy in our narratives. The trickster claimed the whole book, essentially. When I set out to write it, I did something probably a little bit unusual, which is I didn't grow up with my dad. That's part of why I write about being indigenous all the time, because I'm half, actually. My mom is white. My dad is Native. So he left when I was 6 years old, and I always had this sort of sense of loss because of that, and trying to understand who I was, because, I came out looking the way I look. I mean, this is a podcast, but I'll just say, like, I'm brown, I have long hair. They also stuck just about as Indian a name on me as they could have, Julian Brave NoiseCat. Like, nobody hears that at the school attendance and is like, what's your ethnic background? Like, it might as well have been John Redcorn, man. Like, that's the truth of the matter. And so, here I was being raised by my white mom with my Native dad in the wind, who was also, by the way, like a noted Native artist. So he was kind of like out there in the wind. Like, I was seeing him, but like he wasn't present in my life, which is another dynamic. And I was trying to figure out who I was, which is why I probably became a storyteller. I think that sense has sort of led me to, here's where I was. That sort of sense led me to do something unusual, which was to move in with my dad to write this book. This guy who I hadn't lived with since I was 6 years old. I lived with him for 2 years while I wrote We Survived the Night, so that I could figure him out and his story out and our relationship and who our people are and all these different things. And while I was doing that, I also had this notion that I was going to learn more about my people's oral culture, our stories, you know what I mean? Because I was working on this documentary about a system that nearly killed off my people and our way of life. And when you're doing that, you naturally ask yourself, like, what part of that do I have a responsibility to try bring back to life? You know, like, we survived a genocide. We've got to come back from that genocide. We need our culture to come back in a more powerful, strong way for the next generation. You know, I think all Indigenous peoples feel that way about our ways. And how am I going to do that part of our responsibility? And so that led me to this is funny to me. I had never heard someone except for once tell a coyote story in my entire life. And so the truth of the matter is, the way I learned these stories was I was reading articles on JSTOR. You got to picture this. Like, I think it's funny. Like, native guy hunched over his, laptop on JSTOR, devouring ethnographic texts from like 100 years ago that have in them the body of, stories about his trickster ancestor, the coyote. And so there I was, learning about my people through the internet and like living with my dad. And one day it kind of just clicked for me. I was reading about the trickster coyote in the PDF, and it was describing him as this, essentially deadbeat dad, survivor, epic creator, destroyer. And then I was looking out at the carving studio where my dad was working, this deadbeat dad, survivor, epic creator, destroyer. And it just clicked for me. I was like, oh my God, like, my father is the trickster coyote, which of course he is, like, that was our first ancestor. Of course, there's elements of the coyote in us. There's elements of the coyote in my dad. There's elements of the coyote in my grandfather, who had 19 kids with 7 different women, who, like, as I joke in the book, like, I don't want to make light of womanizing, but like, this did give us our giant family of relatives. He helped our people almost single-handedly come back from a genocide, and so I'm just grappling with this thing. And the way that I did it was through our own tradition, was through finding and discovering stuff about our people and how we told stories that I never would have anticipated when I set out to write this thing. As I said, I initially thought I was doing like Evan Osnos, who in turn was kind of doing, like, I don't know, maybe his take on Marco Polo.
Yeah, well, I love how you kind of braid in the coyote stories and legends, and how that really dovetails nicely with your own story and your father's story and your grandfather's story. Structurally, how did you arrive at that? Or the light bulb moment of like, this is the framing
difficult.
Device.
Yeah, that was so difficult to figure out, man. And here I would say that editing a documentary was super helpful. I'll say 2 things. So editing a documentary at the same time as writing We Survived the Night was super, like, liberating for me, at least intellectually, in terms of how I thought about editing and structuring my work. Because when you edit a documentary, especially a verite documentary, which is an observational documentary where you're like constantly trying to solve the puzzle of how this set of footage can be put together in such a way that is legible and also has the filmic quality that you want of an observational documentary, which is to make it look more like a fiction film in a way. It's kind of like verite is as to documentary as narrative nonfiction is to nonfiction. You know what I mean? It's part of like documentaries turn towards what writing did in like the 60s and 70s with like Norman Mailer and all that. And so I realized that you could cut up a narrative and put it together like so many different ways before you figured out the right way to do it, which made me way less attached to the way that I was writing down the narrative at first for We Survived the Night. I initially, I think as writers, we often have a preciousness about our words and the way that we chose to set them down onto the page or into the Word document or Google Doc or whatever you prefer. And I realized that like I could write it down, and I thought it might be this way. I had some sense of how it might be structured, but like I could also try it lots of other ways, and that was super liberating. And so I started thinking about the book as also, because I'm working with these cultural forms at every level, from the title of the book, at every level, from the word to the structure. because the coyote stories are there. And another way in which I structurally think about the book in a cultural vessel or form from my own people is I think about it as a woven narrative.
Mm.
So in my people's arts and traditions, weaving is considered like the highest art form. My great grandmother was a weaver. My great great grandmother was a weaver. No offense to my father, who's a carver, but actually it's their work that is considered the prized heirlooms of our family. And so I thought about the book, which combines elements of memoir, family history, reporting, coyote stories, as a sort of woven text in a sense that is honoring and echoing, the weaving of my ancestors, which, it's worth pointing out also that weaving, interestingly, is a feminine craft.
Yeah, yeah. You're bringing up that degree of weaving, and I also got a sense that through the coyote stories and how the coyote is something of a a shapeshifter as well. The way you go about telling the story in the book has shape-shifting elements because you are telling these personal stories. It does get into pure reporting. It gets into some like ethnography, even like profiles of prominent Indigenous women like Deb Holland and Mary Smith,
Mary Simon, yeah.
Mary Simon. So you have all those elements of like even the mode of the storytelling, it changes shape and form throughout the whole thing.
There were elements of this that were like planned or thought through, and there was other things that you kind of this is the other fun thing about making art is you discover things about your art as you're going through it and as you're making it. And so those were some of the things that I wasn't initially thinking about. I was just trying to figure out how the hell it would like make sense to put it together, but then I was also eventually thinking like a little bit of a meta way, like, oh, like if I'm telling the coyote epic, what is the coyote epic really? Like what is at the core of this narrative? And one of the core things is definitely a study of transformation, which is such a fundamental. I mean, I want to just make the point that indigenous oral traditions have rarely ever been taken seriously as serious works of the humanities, and yet they are contending with and giving explanations to some of the biggest questions that our species, our brains have ever asked. And one of the big ones is like, what's transformation really, and like what drives it, and how does it happen, and how should we think about it? And in a sense, like in the most sort of pointy-headed way to think about this, the coyote stories are contending with that question. The coyote himself is a shapeshifter. He's a transformer. And as he's going about his work in the story, he's engendering transformations in the environment, in the culture, in the life of our people, in the land itself. And, in that sense, and if you want to take it even further, the narrative itself is a transforming narrative, right? Like one piece about this that I've thought about a lot is like, what is the legitimate way to retell an oral tradition that remains true to it being nonfiction, which is how our people viewed it, while also saying like this narrative deserves to live in the present, which is to say that it deserves to do what it always did across time, which was it changed, like tradition is not like, there's this notion that tradition is like you took a snapshot of the Indians when they met the first white man, and that's what their culture is and always has to be. But of course our culture changed all the time. It was changing before white people showed up, and it's changed a lot after they showed up, and yet it is still our culture. And so what parts of that culture are like inherent and essential and need to be passed down, and what parts of it deserve to change and respond to the times, which is what any successful tradition, any successful culture does, right? It makes itself relevant to its people in the generation and moment that it is living in. And that was something that I was kind of trying to think through as I was engaging with, in particular, the coyote stories in this book, but the whole thing.
Yeah, and there's a moment too of a myriad notes I have typed out, of which we'll just get to a few, but it's so really rich. And in chapter 11, which is Indian Acts, you start that chapter by saying like, I've told the truth, so it's only fair at this juncture as I start to look out at the Indian world with a loving yet critical eye that I look in the mirror. And structurally, why wait 170 pages or so to do that to gaze into the mirror?
Well, I'll just be honest and real and say that my experience across making Sugarcane and also writing We Survived the Night, because I appear as a character in both the film and the book, is in the edit, the last character truly to emerge was me.
Mm.
And I don't know if this is true of everybody who writes, nonfiction that includes themselves in it or writes stories that have some of themselves in them. But I find telling a story about the self, of understanding the self, to be one of the hardest things to do, actually.
Yeah.
It's easier for me to look out at my dad and the world and to report on it and tell a story about it. But when I have to like look at myself and really figure myself out and what it is that I want to say about myself that gets at the truth of the whole thing, it's hard, man. It took me a while it took us a while to figure it out with Sugarcane. It took me a while Indian Acts was actually like the last chapter I wrote of this book. I think it was that and the epilogue or the in the end, as I call it.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, it took me a while to get around to that. And also I think it was because I wanted to in the appropriate place in the memoir of the narrative. Because it isn't exactly chronological, but it does sort of begin in a way that begins with my father's birth and then sort of proceeds through my childhood. I wanted to contend with the way that I write about my dad and my grandfather and other Indian men through the character Coyote, who is a trickster who does some good but is often up to no good. And my dad is definitely the coyote in certain ways, as I mentioned. My grandfather was certainly the coyote in his own ways. The coyote is like the father of our people, and my grandfather has a real case for being one of the fathers of our people too. I mean, that man has, if I had to ballpark it, few hundred descendants already, like that many. So, and he's got another one on the way because me and my girlfriend are expecting. So, he did his role for our people, and that's a beautiful thing. Also, it's given us a big family, and I love having so many relatives. It's cool. I mean, like on the one hand, the womanizing sucked for my mother. I mean, my grandmother, and I know that it still hurts her to this day, and yet like it's pretty awesome to have like 100 plus cousins out there, man. Like it just is cool. I really love it.
Yeah.
And I think therein lies an observation that I try to then, and here I'm doing it again. It's so hard for me to talk about myself. An observation that I try to observe, in my own life, which is like the forces that create the world and a lot of relatives is to me a good in the world are complicated, and are sometimes connected to our id, right? The thing about the coyote is, sorry to be vulgar, but he's like constantly feasting and fucking and like stealing stuff and getting his stuff stolen. Like, that's kind of his whole deal. Which is to say, he's just like the appetite unleashed on the world, which like is true of the actual literal coyote out there, right? Like the coyote is just like constantly trying to get his next meal. In a way, we all are. Um, and I think that acknowledging that in myself was something I had done for my dad, my grandfather, and I needed to acknowledge it in myself. And so for me, there were two parts of me, maybe three, wherein I was really driven that way. One of them that I talk about explicitly is alcohol. So interestingly, my dad was an alcoholic, and I promised myself when I was a kid that I wouldn't become, a drinker. And then I look back on parts of my 20s and I'm like, man, I was drinking like pretty hard. And like, there were moments in time where I got behind the wheel of a car, did something that was like really foolish. And there were moments in time where I actually did put myself in like significant bodily danger because of the decisions I was making, and other people too. And did I want to be that person? And so I write about that, which is a real thing for a lot of people. And, I mean, it's one of the big stereotypes about Indians. And I'm going to be honest with you, like, I don't condone stereotypes, but it is also true that like a huge number of my members of my family have struggled with alcoholism, my dad and myself included. I haven't had a drink now for 5 years. And the other one is relationships to women. I I was kind of a child of two worlds, which meant that I would be, in school during the year, and then eventually off at college and university and trying to make a career in the white world. But then I would spend summers on the Canim Lake Res and out in the Indian world doing Indian stuff. And they are separate worlds to a huge degree, which made it possible for me to basically, I'm going to be honest about it. And I'm not like proud of this, but it is my truth, to have start a pattern where I would have like a girlfriend in this world. And then, when I went off for the summer, I'd go get another one over here. And, in that sense, like while I was trying to not become my father, as so many of us are not trying to become our parents, I was becoming like my father. And, if I look at my grandfather's pattern of behavior, which is the DNA evidence is strewn all across the province of British Columbia, in certain ways, I wasn't so different from Ray Peters, Zeke, myself. And that's the truth of the coyote story for me, and the coyote in me. And, at the same time, like I will say, I think that being a trickster has also, like, paid some dividends for me. Like I've gotten to do some cool stuff in my life, and I got to contribute to some stuff that actually, Sugarcane made it all the way to the White House, and we were present for Biden's apology to the boarding school survivors here in the U.S. When I worked in politics, I, through some activism and mischief, helped make Deb Haaland the first ever Native American cabinet secretary. And, same guy.
There's a moment in the book as well where you say, like, every time I fall for someone who isn't Indian, I feel like I'm staring down the barrel of assimilation. Like, it's like my heart and blood are at odds. And it was like it was like such one of those moments that I just wanted to get you to unpack that thread a bit, because it is a very real thing that I imagine you're wrestling with.
It's so real, man. Me and my partner are both First Nations, and we both have status under the Indian Act, which is relevant for the story I'm about to tell. And as I said, we have a kid on the way, so this is not a present concern of mine now. But in Canada, there's this thing called the Indian Act, which is a federal piece of legislation that governs who does and does not count as Indian under the Indian Act of Canada. There are two designations of Indian under the Indian Act. There's a 6'1" Indian and a 6'2" Indian, and it's not in height, unfortunately. I'm more like 5'11". And my dad is a 6'1" Indian, and that just means that both of his parents were Indians under the Indian Act. My dad's fully Native. My mom is an Irish-Jewish New Yorker, and if she heard her talk, she really sounds the part. And so as the child of a status Indian, a 6'1" Indian, and a non-Indian, I'm what's called a 6'2" Indian, which means that under the Indian Act, if I do not have kids with someone else who is an Indian under the Indian Act, our kid would not count as Indian, which would mean that it would mean the legal death of my people.
Yeah.
Like maybe I could still pass on the culture and stuff like that, but like a whole set of rights that and someday maybe return of our land and all sorts of stuff that I am entitled to as a status Indian, like the ability to cross the U.S.-Canada border with my Indian status card, which is a right I use all the time. The right to fish in certain times of year in certain places, et cetera, which is core to my people's culture and way of life. I might not be able to practice. My descendants would not be able to practice those, which is to say that I would not hand down my identity to them in some fundamental legal ways.
Yeah.
And there is no other, to my knowledge, race in North America that has their blood purity legislated in that kind of a way. And it makes dating as an Indian like a kind of crazy thing, especially if you're one in my position, because I am half, which does create, like as someone who is half, I will say, like, I feel a fear of, like, I am basically the generational pivot point in a sense, right? Like, am I the moment in time wherein my people assimilated? And over time, like, one of the things that terrifies me is would I look at my grandkids and be like, my grandkids, I did my part in passing down our culture and our people to them. And, the truth is like, after, even with the best intentions, after so many generations of not being intertwined with it, like with your partner, the likelihood that it gets handed down does decrease and decrease and decrease. I've seen it happen. I've looked at that question myself, which, I think it's crazy to me they haven't made like an Indian dating show yet. Cause that is such an interesting premise for a reality TV dating show. And I think it's just another example of the persistent erasure of my people that we have not yet gotten our reality TV show. And that is what I'm resting my case on. Thank you.
Yeah. It's wild and sad that you have to like kind of do that math, in a way. Like now your child will be like, okay, now it doesn't, they don't have to make that distinction and decision about who they might who they should partner up with and maybe bear a family in the same way that you have to do that math in a way
Yeah,
like
my kid's gonna be in certain ways. My kid is gonna live in a more simple, maybe not simple. That's not a fair way to put it. In a world wherein they are going to be more firmly rooted in their identity and culture than I was, and I think that's a really beautiful thing. I'm so excited about that, and
yeah.
I hope that someday they will have the context to understand how lucky they are to be so rich in culture. Like a thought that I had just the other day is that like my and Joan's kid, is going to be the most culturally rooted in our people in maybe on my side of the equation. I wouldn't necessarily ballpark it for her side of the equation, but on my side of the equation, something like 100 years, like 150 years maybe since our people had this much integrity and pride in our culture. And that I think is a really profound thing. I think that's really beautiful. And I do feel, if I feel a commitment to any project in my life, it is to that project of my people and all indigenous peoples, to make sure that our stuff, our ways, like, continue to survive and to come back stronger than they were before, that the next generation has more than the prior, that they get closer to that return to our ancestors and their strength and power, because that is the core idea in a lot of our mythology, right? Like we viewed our ancestors, as complicated as they were, even if they were the trickster coyote and they were out there, up to no good, but making a lot of good in the world. Like, there is just some inherent beauty and power in our ancestors, in the way that they connect us to each other and us to our land and our place. And there's something that I think indigenous peoples understand in that, as being fundamental to our humanity, and essential for us to continue to remember and honor and pass down.
Yeah. I think I read somewhere, and this is probably through like that white rubric, that the indigenous story is always painted as tragic. And I love hearing the way you're articulating this like hopeful resilience. And I think that's like a key. The work that you're putting out there is so fundamental to that reconfiguration of the narrative, the seizure of it for you, and to broadcast it in a way that reframes it in a way of resilience and hope and empowerment. And I like, it's part of the reason why I loved your book so much, and that's just, I think, a fundamental reframing that I think so many of us have to grapple with.
Yeah, and I think that it's interesting you brought up the word power, because I'm going to be honest, that is actually one thing that I do think about. Part of the stories that I'm drawn to telling in We Survived the Night are stories where I see, or stories where I'm looking for, at least, indigenous peoples expressing our power, our strength as a people, because we are almost never seen as that in the way that they tell the story about North America. We are viewed as maybe history's greatest victims. We were the ones who had to die for progress to happen. That's the way that the story was told for so much time. And there's an element of truth to it. Like, if you look at any statistical measurement of misery in the United States or Canada, death rate, life expectancy, homelessness, addiction, alcoholism, abuse, violence against women, indigenous peoples fall to the statistical bottom of all of those categories. So there is some truth to, like, we are the poster children of misery. And yet that is not the whole story, because it couldn't be. Otherwise, why would we still be here? They
Yeah.
did try to kill us off, and yet we are still here, living in our communities, in our cultures, now starting to reclaim, our power. I mean, some of us are casino owners and operators who make billions of dollars. I mean, that's not my people, but that is a huge part of the story of North America. And so, I'm interested in stories of indigenous peoples reclaiming and exercising our power in various ways. That's part of why I wanted to write about Deb Haaland, who I was involved with as well, as a political person, an activist, however you want to say that, a writer. And also about Mary Simon, who is an Inuk woman who rose to the office of the Governor General, which is the embodiment of the crown, the representative of the sovereign in Canada. And many other stories in the book, where that is sort of the part of the lens of analysis, is what is it for my people who are never seen as powerful, but who have actually figured out ways to get back some power and to retain our power. How are we doing that?
Yeah, there's I think when you're writing about her, you quote her as saying this great point of, there was a word in Inuktitut, and I'm sorry if I butchered that pronunciation.
Oh, that was actually good.
It means to never give up, to keep going, no matter how difficult the cause may be. You never gave up. You continue to tell your stories. Together, you confront this painful past. And I just think, hearing you talking about the power in that reclamation and, having her give voice to it, like that to me was one of those paragraphs of several throughout the book that kind of that illustrates sort of the beating heart of the entire text and the fight that continues.
Yeah, and I'll just point out too that in that passage, I'm not Inuit, but I am trying to take seriously as a mode of analysis of this Inuk politician, the Inuit tradition that she is a part of, which, by the way, is also a political tradition. The Inuit have their own movement that has been, nobody really knows about this like globally, but the story is, if you look at the northern part of the globe, the far northern part of it, you can't really understand it without understanding the Inuit people. First of all, in many parts of that part of the globe, they are still the majority population. So you can't tell the story without the majority population. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
As many times as we try to do it in different parts of the world, you just can't. They also have, over the last 50 years, been remarkably successful at advocating for themselves and their rights. They were core to making Indigenous rights solidified in the Canadian Constitution. They were part of a group that got the first modern treaty in Canada after Quebec was going to erect a bunch of hydroelectric dams that were going to flood their territory and the neighboring Cree people's territory on James Bay. Through Mary Simon's work, the Governor General of Canada, before she was the Governor General of Canada, they reshaped international affairs at the Arctic Council, where they have seats that are just below the level of nation states that are party to the Arctic Council, which is only nations with territory in the Arctic. So that's like the United States, Canada, Russia. Inuit and Indigenous peoples in the Arctic have a non-state actor status that is actually given more primacy in the conversation than observer states like China, like the United Kingdom. So when you're talking about the affairs of the Arctic, at least in the international bodies that set some of the agenda there, Inuit get to speak ahead of, have a little bit more leverage than the People's Republic, at least nominally. That's what the system says is supposed to be the reality. I can't speak to whether that's like the truth on the ground all the time. And I think that is not a way that Indigenous Inuit people are seen as powerful. And secondly, they did it through their own political tradition that has been effective at managing their relationships with white colonizers for a long time. It's worth pointing out that the Inuit were the first people to meet Europeans in North America, despite the way that the story is told. They ran into the Vikings way back in the 1200s. And at the end of that encounter, who was still there? Not the Vikings.
You see a similar thing, I think, in North Carolina with the Lumbee people, and just like that that lost colony, the chapter you write about too. It's just like the colonizers come in and like they couldn't hack it, but they kind of just probably were more or less absorbed into the culture where they were. And that was like a really riveting chapter to read that story for sure.
That one was such a prism of learning for me, man. I didn't know about the Lumbee story. So often, by the way, in the book, I'm not retelling histories and stories that I myself knew. I'm actually doing what the reader's also doing at the time, which is learning, right? There are a whole bunch of books out there that are doing kind of like what I describe as Indian 101. Like, Indians are still here. We don't live in teepees. We had our land and our culture stolen, and we're trying to get them back. And those books are important, and I'm glad that they exist, but that's not what I was setting out to do with this book. And so was really drawn to stories where I was going to learn something about Indigenous life in North America, because I think there's so many, to my point, to our conversation earlier, like there's so much we don't know, man. Like there's so much to learn out there still. Like this is on the forefront of knowledge and culture and art in an actually significant way that is not seen. But we're still learning stuff, man. Like our people are still learning stuff about ourselves. And so, the Lumbee story is such an interesting one to me because I didn't really know it. But basically, here's this tribe in North Carolina that claims to be descended from the lost colony of Roanoke, which is, to jog your listeners' memory, the first English settlement in North America that mysteriously, this is the part that is in air quotes, disappeared after being founded, but in fact actually just assimilated into the neighboring Algonquian peoples. So the fact that the lost colony of Roanoke was ever called the lost colony of Roanoke and was treated like it was some great mystery of American history is actually a bunch of bullshit, because it was obvious at the time to the people and is obvious to historians now that they did the logical thing to do in that situation, which was that they assimilated into the neighboring indigenous cultures, which, by the way, is antithetical to the notion of whiteness and assimilation that we are usually told about race and history in North America.
Yeah.
We are told that assimilation is unidirectional for Native people, that we always assimilate into non-nativeness, into whiteness. But in fact, the first act of assimilation on this continent by English-speaking people went in the other direction, and that happened all the time in actual history. We can't see it because for whatever reason, we cannot conceptualize people choosing to assimilate into indigeneity because we have this inherent bias against it being backwards and worse and less than and primitive. And in fact, that happened all the time with great regularity in North American history and culture. And that is the history of the Lumbee people. And interestingly, because they are a mixed tribe, they are not able to, under the racial blood quantum based regimes of who does and does not get to count as Indian, they to this day, despite being the largest tribe by population east of the Mississippi, they to this day do not have recognition as a tribe because they have this mixed background that didn't fit into the assumptions about racial purity that shaped these laws when they were written in the 1930s. And interestingly, now there might actually be about to get recognition for the first time because Donald Trump promised them this, which is another whole layer to the story that we can't even get into. But there's a whole other part of this that is like its own prism into the bizarreness of race and culture and politics in America and in the South that I think gives you a different vantage point. And here's my point, more broadly speaking, gives you not just a different vantage point into Native people and our history and culture, but it actually gives you a different vantage point into the whole thing, the history of America, North America writ large, and its history and culture and present.
Yeah, and getting back to your father a little bit, there's a moment where you're like, don't get me wrong, I love my father. He may wound me, but I love him, so I let him wound me. And, that's part of the coyote story and that you braid and weave through the book. But I wonder for you, like how you gird yourself against that kind of pain that you know is coming, though you still love him and always will.
Yeah, I mean, it's a hard thing for me. I still struggle with it for sure. And I guess I would put the responsibility usually the other direction. I actually felt a great responsibility to my dad and to my family, to my grandmother, and to not hurt them with the stories that I was going to tell. And I just took on as sort of an assumption in that it was going to be painful and hard for me. But here, that is part of the privilege of getting to tell the story, right? Is that it's a hard story for you too, but you get the responsibility and the role of helping to tell it to the world, which is a huge thing. Like the fact that my people trusted me to tell a story that is relevant to Indigenous peoples around the world about the cultural genocide that happened to us, and that it got to travel across Canada, across the United States, to New Zealand, to Norway, to the Sami people, the Indigenous peoples of Scandinavia. Like that's a beautiful thing to get to do. And so, the pain inherent in telling that story is just, I think, part of what you commit to when you make the commitment to go all the way there with a story about what happened to us and our people. So I felt more responsibility to my dad, really, and to my family and to them and how it might impact them. And so I tried to put every bit of craft and intention into the way that I went about it. But where that would maybe fall short, or where you couldn't predict how your family would react to the story that you told both for and about them, I filled that space with prayer, man, to be honest with you. Like I filled it with ceremony and spirituality. It's worth pointing out that the history of the Indian residential schools was one of a spiritual colonization of our people, wherein one way of life was attempted to be eliminated and replaced with another. And the way that we've always told these stories has left open the possibility that that there is a spiritual part of our life and a spiritual explanation to events. And when you're engaging with questions of life and death, of the survival of your father biologically, of the survival of your culture, I think that those are inherently spiritual questions in a way that purely secular approaches are not fully equipped to answer. And also, like, it couldn't hurt to pray for for these stories to be easy with my family. At the end of the day, like, I didn't know if it was going to help, but it couldn't hurt, to be also out there fasting for 4 days and 4 nights with no food and no water, during the summer solstice, to pray that these hard stories that I felt called to tell, or that I was put in the position to tell, were easy with my loved ones and with my people. And also, now mostly on the other side of it, I mean, the book's only been out for a month, but like mostly on the other side of it, I can say with pretty strong certainty that they have been easy with my people, and my family has embraced them, and other people have embraced them to a certain extent as well too. And who's to say that the prayers weren't part of making that happen?
Yeah, and late in the book as well, you have a conversation with your other father figure, Coco, and it's a tough conversation. And a lot of people who write memoir, they might have to have very tough conversations in interviewing loved ones to try to get to the bottom of something. It's not like interviewing a source for journalism, which can be its own challenge, but there's a bit of distance. But when you're interviewing family and having those conversations, it's really hard, and it's kind of awkward, and it's, don't want to push too hard. But how did you navigate those conversations, especially the one that you're kind of having at the end of the book?
I think that I approach these conversations not as like a journalist in an interview, but more as just like a family member who's hanging out and trying to learn things and hear the story. And I think I try to come into things from an obtuse angle often. So rather than like putting the recorder on the table and like, saying like, let's talk about the fact that you held a knife to my mother's throat, to Coco, like I went and visited him and saw how he was doing, and we went fishing, we did like all these like father-son type things, which were implicit acknowledgement of what he was to me when I was a kid for a number of years, which he was a father figure. This was a man who helped raise me, who helped maintain my connection to my culture and identity through his actions when my dad was gone and while he was with my mom. Then, after spending some time, like I would be clear, like, hey, do you mind if I like record our conversation here? And, as we got into it and different things like that, I would, at a certain point, like ask the question in a obtuse way. I'd ask about a certain story around that I knew was around that, or, that sort of a thing, as a way to sort of allow him, in whatever way that he felt ready to do it, to start going there with me. I think that also a big part of it is like, and I learned this from Bob Caro's writing about writing,
Oh yeah, great book.
actually, at a certain point, you just like listening and nonfiction, all this sort of stuff. And this is true for documentary too. It's not actually about the questions you ask. It's about shutting up, which is so weird now that you're on this part of this where we're just like talking constantly about the work in the promotion mode. But like, actually, the best way to be in an interview or with your subjects or anything else is to be quiet. Like what people choose to say or fill in silence, or what in a image fills the silence, the emotion, the reality of their physicality, of their person, that is often going to speak just as loud, if not louder, than anything they vocalize, and definitely louder than whatever dumb fuck question is that you want to ask them. You know what I mean? Because sometimes the questions are like way off the mark, is the other thing, right?
Yeah.
Yours have not been, though.
Oh, that's very, very kind of you to say, Julian. Well, just a couple more things, and I'll let you get on with your day. You've been very kind with your time and everything. Just as it pertains to writing, be it hard won or from a mentor of sorts. I always love getting a sense of like just writing advice you live by, something that's really struck you as resonant in your craft. And like I said, be it hard won or from someone. What is something that you adhere by or hear to?
Well, I think that one, I think I remember part of the reason why the Bob Caro thing was sticking to my mind, because I remember you sent me the email about this question beforehand. And so I was like, oh, that Bob Caro thing, I thought I have actually operationalized that in my work. And I have actually a Bob Caro story associated with the making of the book. So maybe I'll get into that at some point. We have to. It's the Nonfiction podcast.
Gotta.
But I want to answer your actual question first. And So what I would say, an additional one to that is, and this is actually a piece of writing advice that I think people get a lot that I view very differently than the traditional wisdom. There's this adage that's like one of like 10 commandments of writing or something like that. That's like, write what you know.
Mm.
And I actually feel pretty strongly that you should be writing what you don't know, which is to say that you should be writing what you're learning, what you're still figuring out, what you're sorting through in your material. That is actually what at its best, nonfiction is on the frontier. That's a bad metaphor for an Indian to use, but it's on the edge. It's on the cutting edge of truth and knowledge and culture. We found ourselves on the frontier of culture and knowledge, my child. We were just on the wrong side. But like in all seriousness, no, that is the project, man. It's the art form. Nonfiction, first and foremost, is the art form committed to truth, and to learning the truth and figuring out the truth. And so I think that that's where you should be writing from, and that's where I'm trying to write from. Which is not to say that you're not like fact checking your sources and all that sort of stuff. I'm just saying like I'm more interested in what like you're still figuring out on the page.
Yeah, for sure. And what's the Bob Caro story?
Okay, this is my Bob Caro story. So while we were editing Sugarcane, I was in New York for a couple of weeks. It was our first trip to New York to edit Sugarcane, and I had one day on a weekend when we weren't actually working. So I thought I'd go up to the American Museum of Natural History, which has a bunch of my people's stolen artifacts in it. That's basically how they built the museum. And while I was up there, it was like really busy for some reason. So I was like, all right, I'll check out the New York Historical Society first, which is across the street. And I happened to have the right credit card at the time to get me into the New York Historical Society. So I was wandering around the New York Historical Society, and they happened to have an exhibition on about Bob Caro on writing or on his writing process. And it's in like the hallway. So I was in the hallway. I was looking at the Bob Caro exhibition, and on the wall, there's a photo of Bob Caro as a young man. And then this elderly man comes walking in with two women on his arms, and I'm looking at the photo, and then I'm looking at the elderly man, and I'm looking at the photo, I'm looking at the elderly man, and I'm like, oh my God, I have walked into Night at the Museum, which, by the way, Night at the Museum is set at the museum across the street, and Bob Caro has just walked out of the exhibition into real life. And while I was thinking about that, and I was like, should I go talk to him? I mean, this guy's like the GOAT of nonfiction. There was another guy in the this is an inside joke for journalism people. There's another guy in the exhibit, and before I can like commit to going up and talking to Bob Caro, because like I gotta psych myself up here a little bit. This is like the Michael Jordan of writing biographies or whatever. Yeah. This other guy in the exhibit goes up to him and he says, "Hey, Bob, I'm Jeff Toobin,"
Oh my God.
which at the time was like within a year, I think, maybe a little bit more, give or take, of when Jeff Toobin had jerked off his way out of a job at the New Yorker. I don't know if there's any real way to say that. We all read the articles. I don't know why we beat around the bush when we talk about it in public. He had jerked his way out of a job. He'd gooned his way out of a job at the New Yorker
Sure
on
did.
camera accidentally.
And
And so then my Bob Caro Night at the Museum story suddenly became this like New York two writers walk into a museum like bar story. And then I was like, after that, I was like, okay, if Jeff Toobin is not ashamed to use his name in front of Bob Caro, which it was unclear to me whether Bob Caro knew about that controversy or not. I don't know how online of a guy he is.
Mm-hmm.
I assume not that online. I was like, I'll go up and talk to Bob Caro. And so I went up to him. I was like, hey, man, like I'm a writer too. I'm writing my first nonfiction book. And like, it's such an honor to meet one of the greatest writers of all time. And one of the two women on his arm went, well, some would consider him the greatest nonfiction writer of all time. And I was like, chill, lady.
Yeah, Jesus Christ.
But yeah, so that's my Bob Caro story, man, which I think is, I think it is fun that I have a little story and about running into like one of the greatest on our art form to ever do it, man. I'm really grateful that the creator let me run into that guy on that day in like a true New York moment.
Oh, that's amazing. Well, Julian, the last thing I want to ask you, and this is what I love asking everyone as they bring these conversations out for a landing, is just a cool recommendation of some kind. That can just be anything you're excited about that you want to share with the listeners, and it's like it could be a brand of socks, a brand of coffee, or a long walk. It doesn't matter. So it's up to you.
Oh man, so many things to be excited about. I mean, the one that's sticking in my mind today that I'm excited to open is the new Ken Burns documentary on the American Revolution.
Mm,
I think that Ken Burns has been at the forefront. I mean, this is visual nonfiction, but it is nonfiction still. He's been at the
yeah.
forefront of nonfiction, producing a form of Americana for a long time, and it was up for PBS, which is now an imperiled cultural institution. And so I'm really interested to watch that documentary and see what he has to say about the American Revolution in this moment. We're almost at 250 years since the Declaration of Independence. And I'm also curious to see what his sort of Burnsian, liberal, social democratic version of Americana, how that feels and how that watches in this moment when that sort of a thing also feels kind of antiquated and imperiled. And so I'm really curious to watch it. And also, he's one of the best doc filmmakers. A lot of people would put him on a list of one of the best doc filmmakers of all time. His filmmaking style is not my personal favorite, but I have watched a lot of his stuff. And so I'm curious to watch it for like a learning and craft perspective because I'm starting on my next doc right now.
Oh, fantastic. Well, Julian, this is so great to get to talk about your work and your approach to this amazing book you've written. So just thank you so much for carving out time to do this. This was awesome.
Hey, man, I really appreciate it. And I sincerely meant what I said about the questions. Like, this was a wonderful, wonderful interview and conversation. I'm so grateful for how deeply and thoughtfully you engaged with me and my work and the subjects that we were talking about.
Yes, awesome. Thanks to you. Thanks to Julian for coming on the podcast. Good times had by all. There's so much out there begging for your attention, so I appreciate any sliver you grant this podcast or the newsletters or Patreon. And in some cases of you guys, it's and the podcast and the newsletters and the Patreon. So, hey, making a go of it as a creative person or journalist or creative journalism. Oh shit, did I just come up with a new sub genre? Huh. It's tricky these days, and all we can do is muddle along, get our boots stuck in the mud, and then it gets sucked off our foot, and the next thing you know, your entire sock is covered in mud, and it's wet, and you're up to your elbow in grime trying to pull your boot out of the pit. Yeah, that's what it's like. Okay, as promised, here's a parting shot straight to your brain face. I'm in the throes, if you want to call it that, of ginning up material for the next book. I feel like I've been that way for months and months now, and that's actually pretty true, and the ginning has been slow going. I'd like to think I can announce it in a couple months. The idea itself is sellable. It's just I have to package it like I'm going on Shark Tank, Like when you're selling a book, it helps to think in those terms. Here's your book, product, and you're trying to sell agents or publishers to bankroll it. It's a different kind of maneuver. Anyway, we've heard on this very podcast how you can't write a book in one go. Same goes for the research. It's not to be done in a fever dream, though at times there will be fever dreamy moments. You'll put what I like to call in NFL head coach hours, which is to say you basically commit to the thing for the better part of 16 hours a day. Maybe even you sleep at the office in a cot right beside your computer. Double sessions, film sessions, morning practice, broken marriage, afternoon practice, happy hour, evening session. Sometimes you even reason that if you can't dive in whole hog, then it's not worth diving in at all. And to this I say, bad move, man. It's like cramming for the exam. We all did it. We may have gotten good at it. But in the rare moments of lucidity, those classes where maybe you did a little bit of studying every day meant that when it was time for exams, the information was pretty sticky. And you didn't have to have those pulling all-nighter. Like Patio at UMass, when he just dicked around for an entire semester and then did his final papers in one night. He would just drink a couple 40s, play Ozzy Osbourne's Crazy Train, close the door, and come out. I'm not so sure he graduated. So with this new book I'm working on, threading it around the other tasks, I set a pretty simple goal. Catalog for now, 10 articles a day. That's 50 per week. That's 200 per month of very easy, very manageable, and repeatable work that doesn't monopolize the entire day. And we often make the mistake as writers thinking that if we don't have those giant uninterrupted periods of time, hours, days, then we're maybe not real writers, and maybe we don't even start. Cataloging 10 articles might take me an hour. Can I give the new book in its uncertain gestation 1 simple hour a day to make the slow, incremental progress? Can I make that happen? Same goes for when the reporting really heats up. You make, say, 10 phone calls a day, which is to say you leave 10 voicemails a day. And that's 50 calls a week, 200 calls a month. If you hit 25% of those calls, that's maybe 50 interviews a month. Over the course of a year, you've got 600 sources. That's serious biography material right there. And it comes from the slow accretion of these things, day by day, drip by drip. That bucket fills up, man. We often block ourselves, or the scope of the project is so big that we don't start. It's like building a house. You can't start until you've excavated the ground and leveled the ground and poured the foundation and dug trenches for septic, drainage, electrical, whatever. With patience and rigor and perseverance, eventually you'll see a big-ass structure. You can't put 7 things first. You can't roof the house without a foundation or walls. You can't install windows without walls, man. Last I checked. What's the simplest, most logical place to start? You start there until it feels logical to proceed. Much of this is working backwards, too. If you know you should speak to 500 people, how many per month is that? That's 42 people per month. Okay, divided by 4 weeks is roughly 10 per week. Divided by 5 days is 2. Can you interview 2 measly people per day? On average. Yeah, I think you can. Well, I can. But you sure as fuck can't cram 500 interviews into a month if you've waited too long and dragged your feet. The quality of those interviews and those conversations will feel rushed. And here's a technical term: not fucking good. I'm chewing on that. Maybe you can chew on it too. Like, not the same, that's gross, but you follow me. Right? Stay wild, see you nevers. If you can't do interviews, see ya.